very good evening. Welcome to the Lighthouse on this Tuesday night. Day's just gone. This is Queer Space. This is part of the 2019 core programme for the Architecture Fringe. The Architecture Fringe is all throughout the whole building, so thank you for joining us. The work that we'll be discussing is with us here for Queer Space. But there's also work on the open programmes on the upper floor, so when you're here this evening, feel free to wander around and have a good look. Just some housekeeping first. Most important thing, life safety. If you see me run away, I would come with me, to be honest. You know, if there's a fire alarm, which we're not expecting, I'll be going back out through the front door down the stairs, just where you came in back to Mitchell Lane. So if there's a fire alarm, please do follow me. There's gender-neutral toilets on the level 2, which is just the level above us, so feel free to use them at any point if you so wish. But in general, we're going to be here till about 8 o'clock on the chat, but we have the building till 9 and there's loads of drinks outside, so we'd be stoked if you wanted to stay with us for some social and some chat afterwards, see how you feel. Queer Space, yes, has been an amazing part, a nourishing part of the core programme this year. The overall theme for the Architecture Fringe 2019 is IRL, which is in real life, sorry. And part of the sort of ethos of the Architecture Fringe since founding in 2016 has been to try and pluralise architectural culture in Scotland. So Queer Space is a research and design project which invited some of Glasgow's finest queer club producers and designers to try and imagine their ideal nightclub, essentially, to investigate queer aesthetics, social occupation, and occupation of volume. So I'm going to introduce our lovely panel, because I'm not going to do much talking tonight, because it's about you guys. So from my immediate left, Colin O'Hara here from Hot Mess. Colin, along with Simon Eilbeck, is a co-founder of Hot Mess, a dance party for queer folks and their friends. Founded in 2010, Hot Mess was intended to be an alternative to the mainstream gay scene and now hosts packed monthly nights in both Edinburgh Sneaky Pete's and the Hallowed Poetry Club here in Glasgow. Welcome, Colin. Next to Colin is Sarra Wild. Sarra's a DJ, promoter, and heads up Glasgow's club night and collective 0141. Alongside 0141, Sarra works with Grassroots Glasgow, aiming to improve representation within electronic music for women, people of colour, and members of the LGBTQI+ community. Earlier this year, Sarra was included within the Young Women's Movement Scotland 30 Under 30. Congratulations. And later in the summer, as well as performing, she'll be again curating the late night stage at the Woods in Jupiter Rising Festival at Jupiter Artland. Sarah's got a slightly sore throat, so she might be a bit quiet, so bear with her. We'll see how we do. Next to Sarah is Becca Ziola. Becca is a graduate of architecture at the University of Strathclyde as a Part 2 architectural assistant. Becca worked on this project alongside fellow graduate Christy Doherty. Christy's unfortunately unwell tonight and can't join us, but Becca worked with Junglehussi, aka photographer and DJ Matthew Arthur Williams, on the project tonight. Next we have VAJ.Power. VAJ.Power is Hol McGowan and Sofya Staune. VAJ.Power is based in Glasgow, is a DJ and VJ collective, booking agency and club night running Fuse, dedicated to interactive technology, sound and audio reactive video synthesis to create multi-sensory experiences. VAJ, standing for Visual Audio Jockeys, produced the AV show for the Glasgow Film Festival this year, launching their booking agency in late 2018. VAJ.Power also produced the Fuse by VAJ.Power mix series interviewing music artists about their treatment and experiences working within the industry. In the middle there is Michael Pavlides, who'd been working with Hol and Sofya. Michael's a designer at Glasgow-based Architects New Practice. Welcome to them. Towards the end we have Nick Walker. Nick is from Collective Architecture. Good evening. A renowned Glasgow-based and employee-owned architecture student in East End. And at the very end is Bonsai Bonner, aka Suzanne Bonner. Suzanne's a DJ, promoter and founder of Shoot Your Shot, the electric club night encompassing performance, happenings and the multi-art extravaganza which is Weirdo Warehouse. Pushing political boundaries around feminist and LGBTQI+ issues in clubbing, Suzanne recently co-curated the importance of queer artists in electronic music panel at Soma School, and in August, Shoot Your Shot will celebrate their 5th birthday by helping open the 2019 Edinburgh Festival Fringe. Can you please welcome our panel? So we've got 2 mics. I'm going to pass mine this way, and Suzanne, you've got one down that end. I think what'd be nice is, as we said in the conversations on this project, is architecture is inherently slow. You want to try and investigate something and look into sort of new cultures and new work, but generally to build a building you need a site, you need a client, you need money, you need planning permission. There's a lot of different factors which come into even realising a building in reality. So in terms of sort of reflecting and investigating new contemporary cultures, architecture is kind of generally quite far behind. So for this year's festival, we just piggybacked onto the Glasgow club scene, because why would we not? Because they basically produce queer space on a weekly and monthly basis. So we're very fortunate to work with you on this project. I wonder if I might just start with the club producers to hear about what you might perhaps thought of the initial brief and your approach to queer space, and then we'll maybe go into the designs with the designers. Who would like to start from the club producers about how they approach queer space in the project anyway? Suzanne, you've got a mic. Go on.
How I approach this? Well, I was given the brief, and I thought it was a great opportunity to just broaden my imagination and horizons, and the idea of like money were no object, what would be the perfect venue. And I've already previously met Nick, and I accompanied with Kat, who isn't here. But that's when the idea came in form. First of all, my idea was I've always liked something to be hidden in plain sight, that you could be passing it daily without knowing what amazing things can be going on inside. And I don't have an architecture background, so that gave me the opportunity to work with Nick and Kat, and they gave me further ideas on how to explore with it.
I think from the get-go we started thinking about how do we make a space nuanced, and how being queer and experiences of being queer are not like a solid thing, and that everyone has their own different experience. And I think our idea was kind of based off that.
Paul, maybe you could just expand on your sort of approach to space in general.
I think being given the title Queer Space was quite interesting, because I thought it would be initially queer club space, whereas I feel like as I'm studying, how to make a space safer, that it's, for me personally, it's gone further and further away from the traditional idea of club space, of getting drunk, of going to a place where there are a lot of people you don't know, it's potentially dangerous. And so for me personally, I find it really interesting exploring with Michael and Sofya about a place where it could be sober. It doesn't have to be completely based around dancing, even though that's a great thing about it. It doesn't have to be the way, the conventional way we see going out and going to a club, and how we can make a space that can be contributed to and can be a place of enjoyment that's not just based around one idea of being queer and being queer in a space.
I was thinking about it more in terms of, well, I had a problem with the brief, not a problem with it because I thought it was interesting, but I couldn't put myself in the place where I would think about something that didn't have a site, and didn't seem based in kind of a reality that I could engage with. So I kind of changed the brief. What I did was a kind of response to the brief, but it's just a kind of story or narrative about an existing space, the Poetry Club. So.
I just approached it as, I don't know, I find spaces that I've been to really like, everything is like a Western idea of what a club should be. So I approached it as in, let me apply some of my culture to it. And I'm half North African and Senegalese and all that, so I just applied all of that to what my ideal club space is, because, well, being gay is illegal in those countries, so I just took what they would probably want in a club and put it in a club that would be safe and accessible because we're in Scotland. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Hol and Sofya, just go back to you to begin to go into the design process. You had returned a very extensive response to the brief when we began on the project, and you'd sort of come to the conclusion that heterogeneous space was better for queer space in terms of having multiple functions, different atmospheres, being active and responsive and evolving. But you also generally wanted to find, obviously most clubs are within found spaces, because we don't build structures every week to have club nights, sadly. Maybe soon. But you also then took that found space as a point of departure, which was a quite recognisable building type in Glasgow. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
I think when we were talking about heterogeneous space, I didn't fully understand what it meant, and the term hetero just makes me cringe. So I thought it was like something negative, but hetero meaning multiple like things. It's a space that can be used. It's not passive. It can be actively used by different people, different environments, different levels of stimulation, different receptors and transmitters, and I think that's like an idea that we found interesting, is how can we use a space that was originally like heteronormative, very maybe built by a wealthy person, maybe a space that we can't relate to, which in some ways we can relate to a tenement because we live in them, but so many of them are unused, and it would be interesting to like make it sustainable by changing that space inside, but not necessarily changing the outside.
Yeah, and also just to add that I think for us it was also important to kind of hide it from like unprompted hetero cis gaze, and like kind of protect it in a way so it's not consumed as like, I don't know, as kind of like cool thing, or like, just to make it more about queer people, making the space their own, rather than being like exposed to certain an unprompted gaze.
And that sort of bringing you in. There's a link.
Jumping in.
Go.
Well, first of all, their first response to the brief was indeed overwhelming for me. It was like a 7-page answer. Like, wow. It was very interesting because there was so much in there, and they were talking about all this safe spaces, inclusive, that they want to be part of the city, but hidden at the same time. So talking about this amorphous space, a space that might expand, that it's accessible for everyone. So the way I tried to respond to that was, at the beginning, the first discussions we had, even before everyone met, was the idea of queer space as in a space for queer people, and queer space as in queer architecture, what is queer in terms of architecture. And I was thinking more about that at the beginning. And that's why my initial response was to go to something that's more fluid and more organic and relating to the book that's there, the Space Reader book, which talks about heterogeneous space and how by using the different architectural elements in ways that are not usually used. So instead of thinking about walls and floors and doors, let's talk about the articulation of ground and of envelope, and how by manipulating those we can start creating this heterogeneous space, meaning a space that is very different and in many ways, and offers a space that can be used also for the programmed events, but also allows opportunity for the unprogrammed events. And because in their brief they were talking about, yes, it is a nightclub, but it can be something else. It can be something like a community center eventually. So by my response was like, okay, we will take the Glaswegian tenement, which is something that's throughout the city, you can and use that as a shell, but on the inside let's try and just fuck everything up.
But it was sort of biomimicry you kind of both all landed on, wasn't it?
Yes.
And biomimicry here is described as the imitation of models, systems and elements of nature for the purpose of solving complex human problems. Mm-hmm. And nature seemed to be quite important to the project here.
No, just like talking about nature, I think one of our ideas was the fact that queer is natural because it's usually othered, it's usually seen as something different, whereas like we think that it's a very natural thing. So by like using more like natural shapes, we thought that it would kind of reflect the fact that like it's very close to nature.
Mm. And Michael, can you just take us specifically through the design, perhaps? how biomimicry is coming into this?
First of all, I don't think like it's a finished product, and it shouldn't be a finished product. It's messy, and I think that's how it should be, because ArchiFringe gave us a platform to experiment and explore. It was a month, and I don't want it to be a finished product. So the idea was, you've got this, you start as, it's different levels, but it's this fluid ground that creates these different shapes and spaces that turns then into this, envelope, the kind of web-ish structure that again starts to define spaces, but could also act like as a sound barrier and guide you through the space. As you move lower, you've got this, again, it's the ground that moves and creates this kind of pod structures that could be spaces for gender-neutral toilets, it could be the safe spaces that VAJ.Power were talking about, and, utility spaces, they could be whatever. You've got some two main arena spaces as you move up, and then on the top we have this kind of envelope structure that takes inspiration from Aki Menge's hygroscope, which is basically his whole research is about how materials can be used in more than one ways, and how nature designs for the multi-use and for the multi-purpose. We tend to use timber as, structure or as paneling, while, if you look into the biology and the science within like a piece of wood, you see it has pores, and those pores can absorb humidity. So he made this model, the hygroscope model is a model which just uses these very thin sheets of wood, and when they absorb steam, they just open up on their own without any mechanism. So, I was just using elements of inspiration, just throwing those ideas in there, and,
But would it be fair to say maybe that the investigation or the use of nature to help generate architectural form, space and atmosphere was investigated because it was non-judgmental, perhaps, in terms of if human or non-natural, non-nature-led structures, i.e. physical structures created by human structural society, would have perhaps a more higher incidence index of being judgmental. But if we developed a queer space based on more natural forms, that seemed to be quite important because the natural forms were perhaps self-generating in a sort of more non-judgmental way. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, it could be. Even though I think because we use computers to design the space, computational design is very much the judge that you said within the architecture world. Obviously, because it now what it does, most of the parametric projects we see are very flashy, very object, very in your face. While if we use the same tools, we think we can create something that fits what we were talking about.
Okay, can we move on to Nick, maybe?
I'm not a great fan of parametric architecture. Just throw that in. Just to be a bit sort of, start the bit of a conversation going. I just wanted to say a few things about why I did the project, and for me it was much more about research and the sort of the quick turnaround. And I've got a couple of thanks to make. One is to Kat, who can't be here because she's having a great time in Sweden, so go Kat. And the other thanks is to my partner Alan, who's at the back, who has been involved with clubs for a long time and actually did a lot for the queer scene in Glasgow with the clubs like Abnormals Anonymous and Record Players. And through my sort of involvement with him, I've got to find out a lot about clubbing and gay clubbing and queer clubbing, predominantly in Glasgow. And he's the one who's really queer. I'm a bit of a hanger-on. But I'm just quite interested in this whole idea of and therein lies the connection to Suzanne, because Suzanne's a really good friend of Alan's as well. But I'm just quite interested in this whole idea of space. And as an architect, you have a client, and you always set out with the best intentions to create a space that suits your client. But it could be a library, and then the minute people move into the library, they use it in a completely different way to what you anticipated, because you can only ever design with a fixed set of information and a fixed set of clients. And the minute those clients change, or the parameters of the way you're changing, the way you're designing change, you really don't know what the outcome's going to be. So that's why you see loads of boxes in front of, full height windows in schools and libraries, because people use buildings in a different way to you would expect. So the whole idea of a queer space I find really interesting, particularly because a lot of queer clubs, by their very nature, are underground and are hidden and are different to mainstream clubs. So if you take that premise and then try and posit how you might come up with a club that caters specifically for a queer audience, what is that? Is it any different to a club? Is it actually to do with the people who are in it? So I suppose the process we went through, me and Kat with Suzanne, was really quite straightforward. Suzanne, and actually what I find really interesting is a lot of the themes are similar. So a lot of the themes that you've looked at are to do with being hidden, being in the city centre or somewhere that's quite sort of, surrounded by life, that's flexible. And they're all themes that I think a lot of us have dealt with in different ways. And then I just really fancied having a go at a club and seeing what would come out of it. So our approach is much more straightforward. I think what Suzanne was looking for was an inclusive club. So you were quite specific in that you quite fancied a rotunda. So it became a circle. And the great thing about a circle is it's, by its essence, inclusive because there are no corners. That it was flexible, so you've got this sort of flexible floor that can do a whole variety of things, and that it was hidden in plain sight was one of the first things you said, and how you actually accessed it became by way of a really big ramp, which ultimately made it accessible to all, because it could be, it's a bloody long journey, but it's DDA compliant to get down into the club, and that's really how we approached it. It was quite a straightforward architectural approach, if you like. And that's
And where is this club? Because you chose somewhere site-specific, didn't you?
Yeah, I mean, we looked at one of the things that Suzanne was looking for was somewhere you could go outside and, you know, get some fresh air. So there's quite an interesting history behind Blythswood Square, and it's, you know, it's within spitting distance of Sauchiehall Street, and yet it's you know, it's away from, you know, that horrendous place that is Sauchiehall Street. So it was that sort of juxtaposition that was really interesting, but also that idea that, you know, that part of the town has had a nefarious sort of history and has been always been a bit sort of outside, in that there have been, you know, there's been an area of prostitution and people who have a different way of life through their circumstances. And, you know, again, if you came up from the club, you'd have a fantastic gated off green space to have some cigarettes.
Can you just take us through the design? Because it's very interesting, and there's also a lot of spatial change in here, but also it's to do with time as well, isn't it?
Yeah, again, just this, we really got into the idea of trying to imagine what the club itself would be like, and that's to do with, you know, occupancy, how many people are in there, the music, the visuals, the background. Suzanne was quite, I mean, Suzanne's a bit of a wallflower, so she didn't want so Suzanne was quite keen to be in the middle of the action, so there's, like, you know, a presence right in the centre of the room. And then it was just this idea of, if you go into a club and there are 5 people in it, it can be quite daunting. So how might you make a space that could actually deal with those people who arrive at 12 o'clock and want to feel comfortable, and then how might those walls then drop down towards, you know, the fun, sweaty dearth of 4 o'clock in the morning.
But the concentric walls fall away, don't they?
Yeah, they just fall away. And I mean, it's theoretical, so, you know, God knows how you do it in practice. And then there was this idea that, you know, in Glasgow you can only club until 3 o'clock. But if you go to somewhere like, well, anywhere else apart from the UK, you can club all night. So how do you bring people back to the real world? And it was this idea of this oculus in the centre, and how that could, at night, open up to let in stars, light from stars, or the moon at certain points. But then as the day went on, you know, when you got to 8 o'clock in the morning, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, that oculus could just start to open, and then essentially it becomes an outdoor space, so you don't even need to leave to smoke. So
it's very beautiful. Yeah.
I'm not a smoker either.
But
it's inclusive.
It is part of what used to be the atmosphere. I know it's not. It's frowned upon now, but, you know, it's.
I know.
Yeah.
Seems a long time.
No to smoking.
Just picking up on space, Colin, space was quite important for you as well, in terms of you, as you said before, sort of turned the brief upside down, shall we say, because you had felt that you had already worked hard to find the ideal nightclub, which I'd appreciate if you could tell us that story, but also spatially, you described it beautifully, how through the evening hot mess changes perception for you. Why?
I think, yeah, that was the kind of crux of how I thought about it, was like when you enter a nightclub, it always seems so small and empty, and you can't put yourself in the place where it's going to be in 2 hours' time or 4 hours' time. And so if I'm in the bar in the poetry club, I can walk to the DJ booth in 10 seconds, but getting off the DJ booth, from the DJ booth at 1 a.m. takes like 5 minutes, so you physically can't believe that space has been transformed so much by users and by music and by perception, regardless of if you've taken drugs or anything, because those substances also like facilitate that kind of sense of kind of confusion that you get when you're in a club. And so I was thinking about how perfect the poetry club is, and how I wouldn't change anything about it. But then Andy prompted me to think about some ways that I could change it, and I thought, well, maybe if the walls could move out, or maybe if the room could breathe out. And then I kind of realised that those two things were the same thing, because I think that if clubbing is going well and the space is right, then the club that you find already has the capacity to transform the mind, to transform the space, to physically transform the space itself, I think.
And there was a book that you were referencing.
Yes, yeah. So there's a book called House of Leaves, which is about a house which is constantly changing every time someone enters. So, yeah, I was just thinking about that, like, if what the Poetry Club would be like if it was kind of like this haunted, constantly changing space.
Can I just...
When you go,
you know, I've got a monthly night as well at the Poetry Club, and I do love the space. So I'm interested and intrigued why no changes are made. There's things that I would like to change about the sound system, and other things maybe I like the space itself to become bigger. There are times when I've been to Hot Mess that there are queues outside, and you do work, like there's other places that will put nights on in the city centre that you just work with what you're given, but I love the space, but I don't find it's perfect.
Can I throw a real cat amongst the pigeons? Can you run a queer club in a commercial venue that's actually just there to make money?
That's something that I've been trying to do as this year. That's what I've been learning. There's other bigger spaces that I'm working with just now, and to understand, is there a market for it? Is that what you're wanting? Just to realise that there is a thing that you see, that you become this, you don't want it to be, but you become a queer commodity. I'm blatantly seeing that I'm ticking other people's boxes and I'm not enjoying it, and there's changes that I have to make in the long run. That's the thing about the Poetry Club that I enjoy, that it has, I believe it's there's quite a lot of independent queer nights that are spaced in there, and because of the people that go in there, but there's other venues that I'm trying to do things in.
I was just going to say, I suppose that just conversation, but I suppose that makes it very different to the places that Stefan King runs, the G1 places like, the Polo Lounge and Delmonico's, which are purely there to exploit people, and they really don't give a fuck about gay people or queer people. It's just a money-making business, and people buy into it until they become more educated, and that's really interesting. Is that sort of juxtaposition against what you guys are doing and trying to do something that is it is about the audience and about the people you're trying to support, and how that sort of represents itself within queer clubbing, or the queer sort of map of Glasgow.
There was something that in the talks, it was when we all met up a while back, I think it was yourself, Holly, that mentioned about when venues become part-time to their policies, the gender-neutral toilets are only in when you're there in the presence of it, and then just the next day, it can be 24 hours later, it's just the same shit, different day. And that's something that I've found like a lot of importance I think you have to end up with some integrity to some folk. Well, you have to have integrity to what you're providing, and there are, again, venues that have been in touch with me to get certain there might be someone that they're wanting to have in there as a guest, but they've asked me to promote it because it's a queer independent promoter, but I've not seen them have any attention beforehand to have me in the space, and yeah, I believe one thing the Poetry Club does support you for what you're wanting to achieve in your integrity.
Just staying on behaviour, Becca's and Christy's response to Matthew's brief appeared to perhaps not rely so much on physical attributes, but practices, people, and community. Becca, do you maybe want to go through your maybe response to the brief and your thoughts?
So we were kind of, when we started it, we were kind of jumping back and forth with Matthew, and we were trying to understand exactly what a queer space was, and it was almost as if we were running in circles constantly because we couldn't actually define what architectural attributes could make a queer space. And we kind of concluded on the fact that queer is kind of the people that occupy that space and the practices that go on within it. So taking that on, we ended up discussing what kind of practices can happen. So we basically developed a kind of series of spaces that were very generic and maybe didn't actually, could be kind of, could be almost taken over by queer people and they could make it what they wanted.
Queered, maybe.
Queered, yeah, that's a good good word to go. So we began the process by suggesting that the facade is almost heteronormative, and that means that it exists within the city and no one that's maybe queer would know about it. And once they approach this, they're welcomed into an underground network of spaces. That might be a catwalk, that might be a stage, that might be somewhere to go and have dinner with someone, you know. And these series of spaces have all led up to the club, which exists in the forest and it's completely hidden from the city.
But why would you go and have dinner in a queer place?
Well, this is...
Why would you not just go and have dinner in a restaurant?
Well, this is the interesting thing about it, is the fact that, like, when we were discussing it, we also kind of thought about how queer spaces shouldn't exist only in a club environment, they should exist out with that. So if you built up a space where people of the queer community could go and have dinner, that could happen at any point during the day.
Can I just answer that as well?
Yeah, some of my questions are just sort of, you know,
so. Devil's advocate. I think like some non-queer spaces are obviously dangerous for, like, for example, gender non-conforming people, non-binary people. So yeah, that's why some people would much more prefer to go to a space that would accept them rather than have the anxiety of, you know, will I be stared at? Will it be shouted at, you know?
I mean, I fully understand that, and I suppose as anybody who's queer or gay or whatever within society, you know, when you see what happened to those two women on the bus in London recently, and you think about the repercussions of that, but then you think about, you know, the people who are pushing out and trying to make society change. And I think it's just, I don't have an answer to it, but it's that juxtaposition of wanting somewhere safe, but also wanting society to change. And I mean, I don't know how true this is, but I've always heard that that in Glasgow, it in a gay sense rather than a queer sense, it's always been more inclusive than perhaps other cities, and that's why there's much less of a sort of a village, if you like. And I think that's quite interesting. And as I say, I don't know if it's true. And obviously, there's still violence and hatred towards people who are of a different sexuality or a different gender.
Yeah, I think like definitely Glasgow's much better than Moscow, for example, where I grew up. But yeah, a little bit. But also, I think there is important difference between being a white cis gay man to being a black gender non-conforming person.
Yep.
So you would have very different and quite privileged experiences. So yeah, that's just it. Yeah.
No, I completely understand that, and you know, I'm not trying to denigrate any of this. I'm just trying to see, I suppose, how do we solve this? What is queer space? Because I think what we're beginning to discover is that, because I think it's really interesting that, again, a lot of this is about things being hidden. So, but I think that, you know, I think that's the background we start off with, is that it's all underground and it's hidden.
Yeah, go on. Sorry.
Yeah. What I find really interesting about it as well is, though, you could potentially set up a queer restaurant, and this is something that for queer people maybe doesn't already exist. So if you set up a queer restaurant, then it becomes automatically a safe space for queer people, and I think there's like a definite need for that within cities.
I was going to say hidden is different to incorporated, and I mean it could be both. It could be. I mean hidden suggests that you're hiding away.
Well, why are you hiding behind a tenement facade? Why are we hiding underground?
Maybe I'm taking advantage of the space that's already there and I'm not hiding.
Okay.
There is also sustainability.
Yeah.
It's a level of safety as well. Like for me anyway, like I know I definitely feel different when I enter a queer space compared to like a space that's open to everyone. Yeah.
I think it's the same way that why we would, I don't know if I speak on everyone, but not all of us would put on a night in Solihull Street, for example, because you will have like some probably homophobic, transphobic dickhead walking. It's not so much about hiding, it's more just, you're never going to guarantee 100% safe space. I don't think any of us can say that we can. But it's one way to avoid it is to hide it amongst, not hide it, I hate the word hide it. We're just taking precautions. Yeah, to make it a little bit more, because you're already dealing with enough as it is in there with identities coming together. But it's just to avoid literally any average person getting fucked on the street from coming in and ruining it for the rest of us.
Yeah. No, I think that's important. It is that sort of filtering, if you like. And I suppose that's always been an issue of people just wanting to come and see what's going on and, you know, and then leave. Whereas actually it's about community and about the people who are there rather than just, you know, voyeurs or what have you.
All the best clubs around the world have a strict. All the best clubs around the world have a very strict door policy, as you say, to prevent that voyeurism and people coming in just for their own entertainment. And it's known for the queues that happen at Berghain and other places in Berlin. They've got that entitlement to prevent what comes in through the door, and I think that's why, like, a lot of people crave as well for queer spaces, because they know that there's people in there for the importance of what's occurring and going on.
But I think it's also important to not idealize security, because you mentioned Berghain, but I don't think Berghain is a very safe space for many people.
No.
And it's also, in a way, voyeuristic, because it only let people in that look a certain way. And so
It's about a door policy, not precisely about the security,
right,
but it's about a door policy of what comes in, and you know there is a safe space policies that occur in all of our.
But is there not like a commodification of safe space, that it's just another sort of label to put on some venues? I mean, there are venues where they do have problematic door security staff, and there are issues to do with, you know, branding themselves as safe, but actually, you know, they've not got properly educated people on the door.
Yeah, I don't like the word of self-policing, but it's about the individuals that create that you end up knowing, if you do see anything occur, that you have the confidence that someone's going to speak out about it, and that it's not dominantly, not everyone's perfect at the front, but it's as a matter of someone who has been the first point of contact for many years. It's alerting what comes in at the door. I've had to work on Sauchiehall Street for years, over a decade, and I'm now when I'm on Sauchiehall Street, I've understood how desensitised I became from watching the madness that occurs daily there. Just saw, like, I was DJing there on Saturday in a venue, and just it's a joke of, like, it looks like a Renaissance painting what's happening outside, but it's crazy, and it doesn't appeal to me.
One time before Hot Mess opened, I was at the tramway with a friend of mine. We went to see Michael Clark Company, and then after that there was a party in the Poetry Club, and then, like, a woman got in the taxi with me and my friend to go to the Poetry Club, but she'd never been there before, you know. And as we were driving down Eastville Place, I realised that she was very scared, you know, just because we were driving way down those arches, you know. And so, even though that was always a very safe place for me, it was quite a shocking, like, it made me realise how different a specific person's perception of a location like that can be, you know. So.
Sorry, I'm just thinking back to when you said, what is a queer space? And it keeps getting asked, what is a queer space? What makes the queer community, for me, the best community in the world, is how we're aware of each other's, I guess, marginalisation and different issues that we all deal with as individuals in this community. So I keep thinking, like, for me, it was quite an easy thing to create a queer space or a queer club. I just had to consider someone more marginalised than me, what they would need. And I actually found it quite easy. It was like literally thinking of, like, what would, like, someone who's disabled or is, like, really poor or doesn't have access to, like, things that I do on the daily, what would they need? And I think that for me is what makes a queer space, is considering those most marginalised amongst us and their needs. And if you meet those needs, and the rest of us are fucking cushy, aren't we?
There's quite an interesting overlap there with architecture generally, because as an architect you have to design for the average person. And there is no such thing as the average person, because, you know, if you're designing a school, you've got to design for the average student, or if you're designing an office, you've got to design for the average person using an office. And all of ergonomics to do with architecture is based on the mean, the average. So it's an average height, an average weight, an average occupancy. It's all of those things. So, you know, that's why your kitchen units are 800 high. But if you're 4'6", they're of no use to you whatsoever. Or if you're 6'8", they're of no use to you either. So it's quite interesting, just the whole process of architecture, and that's what I found, you know, in a sort of a research way, interesting about this is trying to work out what queer space is, because all architectural space, by its nature, is a compromise.
Yeah, just coming off the back of that, that's something as well that's kind of always been in the back of my head, like working within an office is a lot of the time you're kind of, you're meeting rules and regulations and you're almost ticking boxes, especially in a corporate environment where there's little acknowledgement of maybe of someone else's needs. It's, does this meet the regulations, tick, and moving on.
I mean, it's even something like, you know, when you're designing for the disabled,
Yeah.
What is a disabled person? Like a 1 in 15 ramp is of no use to someone who suffers really badly from arthritis. So it's great. Well, it's not great, but it's, you know, it's a much easier way to get into a building if you're not mobile. But there are plenty of other disabilities. So all of these are about sort of, in architecture, it's all about sort of compromise.
Yeah, it's like, how do you address the disabilities that aren't visible? Which is what we tried to do with our one. We blocked off, like, it was just sort of considering sound, visuals, what would, I don't know, a deaf person experience of a club be? Or who's someone who's, I don't know, like just mental health issues in general, how would they handle a space like that? So it's just about providing, I guess, rooms where they can go and still enjoy the music, or block off the music if they need to. So having access to like blocking off things like that, like senses.
Do you want to take us through your design, Sarah? Because you had a very specific brief, didn't you?
Yeah.
For Cécile, who can't be with us tonight, but.
I suffer from really bad depression, anxiety sometimes, so that applied to this, which was just, I like trees and water when I'm having bad anxiety. So it was incorporating that into, it's a greenhouse at the butt, like, we didn't finish it, by the way. There was supposed to be a glass bit towards, like, on top of the middle bit. And then there's just, like, water features. If any of you have been to Morocco, there's, like, riads, and, like, there's water, and it smells really, like, inviting and relaxing. But then I realized not every queer person is into that. I'm just a hippie person. But, so to the side of it, there's actually a concrete room. I fucking love a basement, like a sweaty basement with good sound. So we did that, and that's on the side, and it's accessible to, if you can see it there. And then we were like, and it's all one floor as well, so in terms of like physical accessibility, we tried to cover that as well. And then it was little things like, we like it when you go underground, but then basements aren't really very accessible. So it was just like building it so that the ceiling almost was the stairs, so it went down the way, up the way, rather than staircase. Does that make sense? Like the ceiling went one way. Oh my God. And then when you go into the room, it would feel like the room was going underground and it was going into a basement. Just like finding little things like that you can swap around to make it as accessible as possible, but not like you're missing out on what is like an everyday club, like commercial club. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Because when we all met together a good few weeks ago, I think you should maybe work for the Scottish Government to demolish building regulations, because Sarah thought of multiple ways to get around stuff within milliseconds. So, excellent work. Excellent work. Has anybody got any thoughts or questions from the audience at the moment who would like to share any responses to what's been said so far? Please just feel free to put your hand up at the back.
Discussion about queer space and how it can be defined. When you're talking about designing a building, how does the panel feel that things like heteronormativity and cisnormativity, which are usually enacted through things like gendered spaces, changing rooms, gendered toilet spaces, difficulties with creating, space and forms for people with pluralistic or non-binary identities. How do you think actual built spaces, how do buildings enforce cisnormative ideology, and how would your particular designs work towards deprioritizing those ideologies?
When I think of cisnormative ideologies, I think of whiteness, not like the white gaze and what it needs in a space. And so I had to consider like white walls, like just little things like that I know I'm not somewhere that's culturally rich in terms of like someone who's different. Does that make sense? Not that we're different, but we're constantly othered, whether you're queer, black, or whatever. So yeah, we're just trying to think of ways that it would have to be like start from scratch. I honestly couldn't list a single, like I put my night on at the art school and I actually wouldn't put it on at the art school. So it's just like little things, like even our most inclusive, like loved venue for me, which is the art school, I still wouldn't consider that friendly. And I don't mean that in terms of like accessibility money-wise, but more it's majority middle-class English white folk that go there. And you have to like police that constantly. And I don't imagine architecture to be any different. So, yeah.
Sorry. I don't know if this actually answers the question, to be honest. I was like going to go for the mic and then I was like, does this actually answer the question? But it was kind of want to jump off the back of that. For me anyway, like I'm not long in the game of working in an architect's office, but what I do feel is like a lot of the time, in terms of the people that I work around as well, like most of the people I work around are kind of fit into that heteronormative lifestyle. So, and these are the people that are running all the projects. So for me, like that's kind of, I feel like I'm kind of in the background, kind of saying like, why don't we introduce gender neutral toilets? But it's not on the regulations, so we don't do it. I don't know. That doesn't answer the question.
Other architects or?
I ripped the whole interior apart. I didn't use any of that. I just kept the shell. And I think I talked about this before, we've got the tools now, computational design, to start imagining how, one continuous surface could start to, create. So I don't have to worry about a ramp or a stair. It's just one surface and it does that. It could do that. So, yeah.
That's my partner, so I'm not going to answer that. What was the question, Alan? I can't remember.
A queer space is either an object or a place, as in people are the space rather than the building itself. And you're challenging things like heteronormativity and cisnormativity as ideologies. How do you think those ideologies are actually physical in buildings, apart from gendered spaces?
As an architect,
yeah.
I think you've got to have a bloody good client who gives you a really good brief and who provides you with the background and the research that tells you exactly what it is they're looking for. I mean, at the end of the day, an architect is a facilitator. There's somebody who is, mostly talented, one would think, hopefully. You have to work as part of a design team with other consultants, with a budget, with a brief, to try and come up with the best possible solution for your client. So your client will be somebody who is, incredibly knowledgeable about what they want from queer space, and you will provide them with the armature through your understanding of looking at things in a non-normal way, if you like, because in essence that's what an architect does. An architect looks at space in a different way to people who aren't educated or haven't had an educational they haven't had an education as an architect. That's the job, is to think about things in an unusual way, and then working with regulations and all the other bloody things you've got to put up with, like planning and building control. You would hope that you would get a space out of it that met your client's brief.
I think it's not an answer, but more like an addition about that. That's what we spoke about with Holly, and Holly added it to our rating. That the idea of a family home is a very cisnormative, very heteronormative, and also very colonialist, because, like, for example, we're still everywhere, like, if you want to rent a place, there's still, like, always, like, master bedroom, which is, like, an awful concept in itself, but we're still living by those, even though it's, like, a place that have a potential of not being, it's just the space, it's just squares. Why do they need to be specifically like family, like heteronormative, cis family orientated? It's just to add to to the question, basically.
In Glasgow we have tenements, and I think one of the amazing things about tenements is just how incredibly adaptable they are. So they're 135 years old, some of them, and there are so many different ways you can use them, and there are so many different types of family. There are extended families, there are gay families, there are I'm not going to list them all, because the family is, apart from the nuclear family, there are so many different iterations of families now. And I think essentially that's what's good about really good spaces, the adaptability and the flexibility. So one of the current concerns in architecture is about, sort of lifetime homes, which tenements aren't particularly good at, because they don't have lifts. So,
that's why they're bad as well.
Well, they're bad, but they're from a particular time. They're from a time when lifts weren't, available, But in terms of a flexibility of space, they're extraordinary. I mean, tenements deal with large Bangladeshi families or gay couples or loads of things they were never designed for. And I think that's a really good sort of monitor of good design is flexibility.
Just picking up on something that Becca had said earlier about the pressure to try and think what queer space was, and then going on what Sofya said there about a master bedroom, I wonder, it's just a thought bubble, I wonder perhaps, the expectation to define what queer aesthetics are, we're like sort of performing monkeys. But actually when you talk about a master bedroom, perhaps part of the queer conversation is to always subvert and turn that conversation and the gaze back round to the normative world and ask them questions. Why is that space called a master bedroom, for example, rather than all the pressure being put onto queer space to try and prove its existence or prove its difference, when actually a lot of the time these conversations should be just inverted and the question go back to the normal structure.
In an ideal world, it'd be the people causing the problems that would fix them, but that's never been the case ever. So it's either like we need the changes to happen, so we just need to do it ourselves. But I get what you mean by like it'd be good if like the person causing the problem, or the person making it a little bit difficult for everyone else to exist, fixed it. But that's not it's not an ideal world. So just kind of, I guess it's up to us to like make the changes needed and necessary. But also I feel like things like this are really important because it's like you don't know what could possibly happen from someone hearing something that they could potentially hadn't heard before. So I think as long as we can like communicate this stuff and make it available, that's all you can really do at this point. Unless you want to like, I don't know, force some like rich old white dude to like fix something. I don't know what you could do.
Just on Alan's point as well, I mean, obviously the architects here, the Architecture Fringe Festival have kindly segued up to the queer Glasgow club scene because, as we said at the start, you guys curate, produce, manage, facilitate, imagine queer space on a weekly and monthly basis, where due to the nature of architecture we necessarily can't do that so quickly. But I think it's important to make the point that in architectural education and architecture in general, we have a duty to change language and things. It's not just all down to the club producers here, for example. And teaching first year at ASALA, which is the Edinburgh School of Architecture and Landscape Architecture, we have a sort of annual assault on language used within the briefs. It's quite interesting that the language that comes in with the students in terms of their training in society, what they think they should say. We have a project which is looking at a home for an author, and without fault, when they begin to talk about their author, that author is always a he. There's no gender in the brief, but they sort of automatically come out with that, and some of the staff are diligent at turning that around, but the school is picking up things like that in terms of writing the briefs better. But that's you kind of got to look after your own part of the field, right? And there's certainly staff at ASALA which are pushing on, so it's not just in this conversation just the club producers, it's the architects as well. Does anybody else have any points or thoughts from the audience? We'll take two at the same time. Which one at the back first? Yeah.
I think the exhibition is great, and making the other people realize there's a queer club and all that about things. But there's a few things that I feel a little bit confused here. Is that why would the brief have to be the club to be hidden rather than open up to everybody? It's because you guys mentioned, or guys and girls mentioned about inclusive, meaning for everybody, but then at the same time you want to be hidden. And the other things is about the nature bit. I'm not sure it's a cliche thing now. All architecture has to relate it to nature, even though like an underground club have to have some sort of feature about related to the nature, environment, or sustainability. back to the hidden idea that I think, for me, it may be projecting a wrong image to the public that queer people would need to be hidden rather than, someone already. So I don't understand why the brief had to be hidden. And all this project is your imagination about the ideal queer club. So could it be some sort of, we can imagine a society that everybody would accept queer and that we don't need to be hidden? Yeah, that's my...
Okay, just hold that thought. And the other point was it round? I couldn't see. There was someone else? Yes.
Yeah, I found a very interesting point is like, as you mentioned that you said you'd like to join the dinner in the queer space rather than the space opens for everyone. So I'd like to know like what kind of like specific feeling for you feel in the queer space, like with the difference between the other space, and what kind of this makes you feel that?
Okay, so 2 questions there. Sofya?
I wanted to get back to this idea of hidden and why, like, I think we all kind of agree that just calling it hidden is a bit cringy, but I think it's just a reality, as Sarah was saying about, like, it would be amazing if the people who are causing the problem would actually put in the work into solving the problem and, like, take on responsibility, but because they don't, we have to be hidden, even though I'm sure no one likes to be hidden. It's just the precaution, it's just because of the dangers that we can face and people that are less privileged that I am can face.
This is part of the. This is this is part of the struggle, I suppose, isn't it? I mean, I've never had to struggle because people have done it for me before. A generation before me who were, men and women who were visibly gay. So as we've moved on, it's become less of an issue. I mean, I'm from the generation where the first sort of gay kiss on TV was like all over the fronts of the newspapers because it was just so shocking. And I suppose it is about sort of visibility and the need to also feel safe, and it is how do you make other people recognize and see you if you have you have to be really careful of how you go about your everyday life, and that ultimately comes down to violence in a lot of cases, and that's the reality of it. And there are people who do go out there and who do push back the boundaries, and I don't know what I'm trying to say, but I think that's the sort of the difficulty in this. It's that sort of being visible but being hidden, being a space or being a queer space. That's what's really interesting about this project, because I don't think there are any answers, and it just raises a lot of questions. And I think that's that's what these events should be about.
So the word hidden was, just to add to what you were saying. Word hidden wasn't in the brief. I just think it's not part of the brief, and I think that's just what we immediately came to, because I don't have it the worst of it at all, but myself and my partner who's sitting in the audience, we've been shouted at, we've been on the nice mildest levels, we've been called sisters, and which has been around 20 times, I think, since we've been going out, and immediately I think more of a physical reaction to that is to hide away. It's not to fight back, because you're not going to win. And it's to sort of feel oh, well, I know I'm safe in this space, I know I'm safe in this space, my friends are here, they're supporting me here, and you gravitate towards these spaces. And sometimes it doesn't feel like, well, I'm actively choosing to be in these spaces, but it's a place to sometimes retreat to. So it's more like the idea of sometimes retreating to a space which you'll be comforted in. And I think that's just the reason why we were looking at spaces that are the idea of hidden, but I think it's not really hidden. It's more like, how do we incorporate it into, society where it's not so, oh my God, can't believe queer people are trying to build another building. I don't know, but
yeah, like the word hidden as well. I think isn't necessarily what we're talking about. It's more the fact that I think in my brief we described it as a mask, because if you know that this space exists, then you're probably someone who is very welcoming and can have a more inclusive opinion of things. Whereas if you're someone who doesn't know this space exists, there's almost a level of risk that this person could enter this space and be rude to someone or be aggressive to someone. So it's almost a mask that's protecting like more marginalised people within the community.
I think when I think of the term hidden, I think of it's not so much, well for me anyways, it's not so much about hiding it from the public, because I struggle with creating spaces that aren't visible, so like everything's hidden, like we're saying that. Because then I think of like, what if someone has never been given the opportunity to like look into their sexuality? Like, how do you then make sure that they're welcome in any space and they're able to like look into themselves? I struggle with that a lot. Like, how do you make it so that it's safe for your existing community, but then how do you reach the people who actually need these spaces to discover themselves? And that's always a fine line that I struggle with. But I think what I always come down to is just creating spaces for the people who need them. And hiding it in such a way just ensures that the people who actually need them are in there, rather than like some person who thinks it's cool or is, like uses the term ally but is really an arsehole. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's just creating spaces that for people who need them is what I keep going back to. But I do struggle with how do you make sure that people who don't know they need that space have access to it?
Yeah, just to add to Sarah's point as well, and to answer the question why the space needs to be queer rather than just a space. And I think because just a space is heteronormative and cis space and white space, whereas queer space is like, it's very like, just a space is a very solid thing, whereas queer space is a nuanced space that allows for catering to different experiences. So yeah, I think that's just my thoughts on that.
All of these are in the sight of everybody. I don't know if it's like none of us need that to have. Do we all need to have a rainbow flag outside of the venue to be there and prominent? No, like Sainsbury's, Tesco, all of that are doing it for us, and but yeah, like it's important that I'd say it's in the plain sight of everybody, but it's the importance of what's going on inside. I don't know if that beauty's from within or whatever shit it is, but
underground buildings can be quite sustainable. Naturally insulated.
There's no budgets here. Questions, sorry.
Just again to say, I thought it's been super interesting, so thank you so much for taking all the time to come over your opinions and thoughts, and the work is stunning. I think there's kind of one point I want to raise before my actual question is, I feel that some way along this conversation we've kind of started discussing queer spaces as very utopian and almost idealised, and actually in some of the most kind of aggressive queer spaces I've been in, as a white gay man, from middle class background and everything else, is actually where I've felt most attacked and sexually assaulted and anxious and not welcome. So we have to be very careful about idealising local spaces, national spaces, international spaces which perpetrate this utopian identity of queerism, which I think is problematic. But beyond that, I think what is perhaps interesting as well is we're here talking as a group of queer people, and maybe that's part of the challenge that exists further beyond this project, is how do we transfer the skills and the learning that have been shared between these amazing partnerships out into the real world. So I'm super interested to learn if there is some transferability from these conversations that you'll be taking forward in terms of thinking about security or accessibility, or even money. I feel money's been mentioned in quite a dirty way tonight, but actually money's really important because it helps us all to be present and keep going and survive. So I'm just curious if there's maybe like one thing from each of the projects that you have reflected and want to take forward.
I think it depends on who's getting the money. If the money's going to Stefan King, then that's dirty. If it's going to Suzanne, then that's great. Sorry.
I think what we were working on with Michael is the idea of like low stimulation spaces, and I have like quite bad mental health issues, and I would say that alcohol and drugs are not good with that. Lights, flashing lights, nope, gonna have a panic attack. And I think working with this made me think, maybe it is possible, more like sober spaces, daytime spaces. Well, yeah, this category is there's but like more frequent, and there's music involved as well, because usually passion is music, and I have to like we have to go out to the space like if we really want to see the artists that we like, but sometimes the other contributing factors make it really hard. So I think like all our ideas are very idealistic because it needs so much money and everybody needs to cooperate, and that's unrealistic, I think. Yeah, definitely like for me in particular, it was different levels of stimulation. Yeah.
Sorry, I just got a message from Matthew because I messaged him saying that we were doing this. He's in Atlanta, Junglehussi, the person that did the other club. But I asked him if there was anything he wanted to share because I think his voice is pretty important. He's one of the few gay black men in the city. So. He says that he really doesn't like the clubs such as like Stereo, Flying Duck, a bunch of other ones will only open their club venues to program. No, they don't open their club venues to program daytime events, and that should be more a thing rather than just art school, because right now it is just art school that does that. And then something else, I guess he agrees with you, which is every so often a sober night as part of the same program would be amazing. And then he gives the example of that night in London that Pussy Palace was started recently, where they'll tell you that it's strictly a sober night, and it'll be a great time for anyone who needs that. Yeah, then he says something about Rost has been so accommodating to us lately. Rost is a club that just opened in Merchant-Say. See, this is where me and Matthew disagree, because I think it's got an awful sound system, but that's just whatever. I feel like even though it's a bit weird sometimes, they're generous with the space being cohabited. I want to see the ballroom group take over. There's also a huge ballroom scene in Glasgow just now that's thriving, so it'd be cool to provide spaces for them to actually practice during the day for free, rather than applying to Creative Scotland every time, which actually, I think they've been rejected twice already, which is pretty bad, but it'd be cool if they could thrive, because they're as queer as it's going to come for Glasgow.
Two of, I suppose, the most iconic gay clubs from the 70s, Paradise Garage and The Loft. Alan, they were both didn't serve alcohol, is that right?
You can get alcohol in Paradise Garage.
Right, okay.
But the Loft had a lot of daytime parties. They did a lot of stuff during the daytime, which was really family and community orientated. So they just served soft drinks. The community brought like a variety of their own food, and everything happened in the daylight. So the Loft is one of the spaces that creates the kind of basis paradigm for that idea that you can have completely non-nighttime events.
Yeah. I'm sure that happened at Paradise Garage. Maybe sometimes. I don't know.
I think coming back to the point about what we would incorporate, I think one thing that we talk about a lot, which is, I'm not sure how it could be done, but it's the fact that as you said, like some queer spaces are actually, like, can be dangerous. And I think like what's important for me, especially as a as an asexual person and in a like long-term relationship, I like the touching, the just being in close proximity to people is quite triggering, and my kind of ideal space is where people are feeling safe, having fun, but also there for the music rather than for I think that those spaces that are more kind of really kind of focused on people meeting each other and stuff, they're really valid. But for me personally, just the space where I can feel safe and feel accepted, but also just zone out to the music, that's my ideal space.
Any final points from the audience, or anything? Would you like to say anything? Yes.
Somewhere where you can zone out to the music and not feel, I just want to repeat that back to you. That was it.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yes.
All of our contributors and all of our designers.
I'm getting there. You want to sit here, Alan? Thank you, though. We did thank you on the wall, kind sir, because Alan was pretty instrumental in introducing me to a lot of the club producers. I knew some of them, but we do appreciate your contribution, Alan. Thank you so much. Okay, well, that was fun. Really appreciate the work that everyone's put in the past month or two. Just a couple of thank yous before I do wrap up. I'd just like to thank the Lighthouse. They've given us the building here for the whole month in kind. We basically complained about the Lighthouse 2 years ago, and they said, all right, well, you can walk the walk then, as well as talk the talk. So we've basically tried to use the Lighthouse as we hope it would be, which is a bit more connected back to local architectural culture. I would just like to thank my lovely volunteers, Matt and Fiona, who have been very patient over there. Yes, go on, pause. The whole Architecture Fringe production team is volunteers. We're all volunteers, but without our event volunteers, we wouldn't be able to run the festival, so thank you for helping us. I think we'll make a t-shirt called Ally or Arsehole, which I think we can sell for the wider good, of course, but I like that, thank you. The brief had said that Queer Space was a working title because, it was a conversation between us all, and we didn't necessarily get to a point where we discussed changing that, and it is what it is called at the moment. But one word really jumped out at me when I read through the contributor responses, which was from Hol and Sofya, VAJ.Power, which was out with, which is a cracking Scottish word if you don't use that in your daily occurrence. But just when I saw the word out with in your response, it really kind of resonated with me with regards to perhaps a very apt and descriptive word about kind of what we're talking about in terms of oscillating between the norm and sort of parallel queer spaces. So I'm not going to say it's called out with, but I thought that was a great word. Thank you for putting that into your turn. But if you'd like just to join me in thanking Colin O'Hara, Sarra Wild, Ziola, Hol McGowan, Michael Pavlides, Sofya Staune, Nick Walker and Suzanne Bonner. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you as well. Thanks. My name's Andy Summers. I don't think I said who I was at the start because I was so excited. So anyway, that's my name.